Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, I have Maggie Doherty on to talk about cruel optimism, affect theory, COVID and climate change, Buddhism, late capitalism, and her book, The Equivalents, and much more. This is a really fascinating conversation. I heard Maggie actually on Open Source with Christopher Lydon, one of, I think, the longest running podcasts in existence, and knew just by listening to that interview that she would be a perfect fit for our show here. So if you like what you hear here, definitely go check out her interview on Open Source with Christopher Lydon and get more of it. But it was a fascinating conversation, and I know that a lot of you will really enjoy this and get a lot out of it. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Maggie Doherty. Enjoy.
I'm Maggie Doherty. I am a writer, teacher, and organizer based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm so excited to talk today on the podcast. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an honor to have you on the show. I actually came across you, as we'll talk about in this interview, from a recent interview you did on Open Source, which is I've been a long-time listener of. And just listening to that overall discussion and your contributions to it, I thought you'd be a really interesting and a guest and a perfect fit for our show here. So really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different stuff, but as I said, we can start off in this direction, which is what you talked about on Open Source with Christopher Lydon recently. Because on that show, you talked about being a sort of student of Lauren Berlant, the author of Cruel Optimism, among other things. So just to start off, can you talk about sort of who Lauren was and what your relationship to them was? And I don't know if you knew them personally or not, but just take that question however you want.
Sure, yeah. So I unfortunately did not have the chance to get to know Lauren Berlant personally. I met them very briefly at a conference once and was very intimidated because I thought they were so brilliant. But I did read a bunch of their literary scholarship and literary theory when I was in graduate school in English. And it really jump-started my thinking, not just my sort of intellectual thinking about work and literature and, you know, some of the things that I was studying and writing about, but also just my life. I felt in a way that Berlant's work in their book, Cruel Optimism, was a diagnosis in some ways of what was like being in graduate school after the 2008 recession, when it was very clear that jobs in academia were kind of gone and not coming back. And yet we were all still going through the motions of training and writing dissertations and applying for jobs and going to these workshops about how to interview for jobs and how to make yourself eligible for jobs. But at the same time, on some level, we knew that this kind of good academic life was no longer available to us. But we still stayed very attached to the fantasy of it, to the idea of it. And this is what Berlant writes about in Cruel Optimism, about how and why we stay attached to, they call them objects, but to people, to relationships, to jobs, to foods, to things that don't really work for us, that are actively preventing us from living better lives. And so when I read this book and when I read some of their other work in graduate school, I definitely had one of those sort of cartoonish light bulb moments where I felt like I suddenly was able to see my life, the world I lived in, the institution that I was embedded in a really different light.
That's wonderful, yeah. Incredibly interesting. I hadn't heard of Lauren before this interview, and now I'm really interested in their work and affect theory more broadly, and that leads us well into this next question, because their book, Cruel Optimism, is considered a work of affect theory. So can you just talk about what affect theory is and how Lauren applied it in Cruel Optimism?
Yeah, so I think maybe one way to think about this is the way that I first was taught to think about this idea of affect. So imagine you go into a room, you're going to a party, and you enter, you go, you ring the doorbell, you get into the house, And you realize that before you got to the party, something bad had happened. There had been a fight, or maybe someone had said something really offensive or controversial that you didn't witness. You weren't at the party yet. But you walk into the room and you can sense in the air that something is in the air. I guess you can feel that there's some anxiety maybe, or some discomfort. Mm-hmm. And that is what theorists of affect call affect, this kind of free-floating emotion that might be found in an institution, it might be found in a community, it might be found in a relationship, but it's not necessarily like a feeling that you might have as an individual where, someone offends you and you feel angry. It's more something that is collective. It's a collective emotion, and it doesn't really sort of spring from any one individual. Isn't really caused by any one individual, but it is caused often by things that affect individuals, by structures, by the economy, by the global pandemic. I think we really have a good sense of affect when we walk out in the street during lockdown and it just feels anxious out there. We go to a grocery store during lockdown, it feels anxious. That's a kind of affective experience. And so scholars of affect theory really take this kind of collective emotional experience seriously. And many of them, Berlant included, understand it as springing from material conditions. So, and this feels to me, or felt to me when I first encountered it, like a really big deal. Because I, growing up, had really seen emotional life as something that was sort of just personal in some way. Something that was just about, my life as an individual, my life in relationship to other individuals. But I didn't really think about my experiences of anxiety or depression or hopelessness or all of these feelings that I might have experienced as something that had to do with the material reality of the world or even the economic reality of the world. So affect theory makes this big intervention by saying, okay, we need to think about emotion as collective, as something that is part of our social world as opposed to just our personal lives, as something that springs from material conditions, that is often a function of economic reality, and as something that can be politicized. I guess that's often kind of the third big move of some affect theorists, not all, but for Berlant certainly, that this is a way of understanding our political life. It's a way of understanding the emotional aspect of our political life, and it's a way of mobilizing, getting people to understand that their emotional lives are not just personal, but are something that they can shift by shifting the reality of the world that they live in.
Mm. Yeah, I particularly find this obviously incredibly interesting and important and prescient for the moment that we're in. You mentioned going out into a public place and feeling the low-level constant anxiety of the pandemic and its constant sort of threat to you and your family's bodily health. I live in a deep red state where at least half the population is constantly unmasked and has been since day one, with a hardcore right-wing billionaire governor who plays into the worst instincts on the right, etc. And I have a wife right now who is in a high-risk pregnancy, and so like just going out into the world, standing in line at a grocery store and somebody stands too close behind you, you do feel like your hackles get raised. And even when you're not consciously aware of the emotion that you might be feeling, your body is. And, I think a lot of us are going through anxiety or depression because of this and many other things in our society. But, a lot of our society also tells us that anxiety and depression and feelings of dread and despair are personal, biochemical issues that you have to deal with through pills and therapy and individual options. But it's becoming clearer and clearer to, I think, more and more people that so much of the negative emotions that we experience are actually, in some cases, very rational, and moreover, are very rational responses to our environment right now. And I know no matter how much I meditate or exercise or eat and sleep well, I still feel feelings of dread and despair and anxiety. And it's very clear to me that those are social conditions that I'm operating in and not individual, neurochemical imbalances or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think you put that really well. And I think it's also important, right, that if these are collective social experiences, then the response has to be collective. So just as you said, you can take super good care of your mental health and physical health. You can take super good care of your family. But in a way, if this is a problem that's not just facing you, but it's facing your neighbors, it's facing the people you live in community with, that affect of anxiety and dread and hopelessness is still out there, no matter what you as an individual do. So that's, I think, where this way of thinking about our emotional lives and of our emotional lives in relation to our economic lives is really helpful, because it suggests that, yes, we should all, or hopefully we have the capacity and the resources to take good care of ourselves and our loved ones. But there are also things that we have to do together collectively to address the situations that make so many of us receptive to these affects of emotion. I'm sorry, these affects of depression and anxiety, and these things that are facing all of us together.
Yeah, definitely. I want to talk more about that, and I think we're going to talk about climate change in a second. But before that, I just kind of like to situate this theory in a broader ecosystem of theory. So how is this approach related to, say, psychoanalysis and Marxism? I think you might have hinted at the Marxism with, taking material conditions and collective action seriously. But I'm just wondering where the tensions and any possible overlap are with affect theory and these other, pretty big theories or theoretical approaches that are out there.
Yeah, I think it's not sort of by any means orthodox Marxist theory, and of course, Marxist theory, especially in literary study, operates in a really particular way. I think it's helpful to think of it, especially of Berlant's work, as a critique of capitalism. And in many of their writing, they were very critical of capitalism, of the way capitalism shapes our relationships, of the way it shapes our emotional lives, of the way it shapes love, of the way, it dictates all of these experiences that we have and could have really differently under a different economic regime. And I think the capitalist element is also a historical kind of boundary for a lot of these thinkers, that they're interested in what life feels like under what people sometimes call late capitalism. And obviously, I know there's a ton of debate about whether we're living actually in late capitalism or post-capitalism, and I, do not have the expertise to answer that question, but that life feels a certain way right now, and it feels a certain way under a neoliberal, government. It feels a certain way in a financialized economy, and that these aspects of economic life have this bearing or shape in some way the way we love each other, care for each other, care for ourselves, the way we experience life on an emotional level. Berlant was a deeply psychoanalytic thinker. It's one of the things that I really love about their work, because I'm a fan of psychoanalytic thinking. But I think this idea of attachment is maybe one place to locate that thinking, and also this idea of fantasy. So in Cruel Optimism, which we've talked about a little bit, they're making the argument that attachment, there's always a certain amount of optimism associated with attachment, that we attach to things kind of out of hope. We attach to things out of desire. And there's this idea when we attach to something, whether it's a romantic partner or a new job or a particular idea about life, an idea about what a good life looks like, we carry hope in that attachment, that we're going to be able to execute this idea we have about whatever it is that we've become attached to. And, optimism is good, and attachment is, good and inevitable. We're going to bond with things and people and institutions and ideas and fantasies as we move through the world. But, and I think this is where psychoanalysis is useful, attachment isn't always good for us. So in Cruel Optimism, Berlant refers to some attachments as particularly problematic. And one example that they give is what some people would think of as the American dream. This idea that if you work hard and you follow the rules and you don't cause trouble and you don't break the law and you're, basically a good citizen, you will be able to attain a certain amount of material security for yourself and your family. You will have sufficient rest and leisure. You will make sufficient money, and you will be able to sort of have this potentially upward mobility, potentially just kind of, stable life for yourself. And I think many of us, and those of us on the left, know that this is not the reality for most people in this country, that this idea of the American dream or the sort of good life as it's been defined in the U.S. is not on offer anymore. But so many of us still feel attached to this fantasy, attached to this idea. And because we can't detach from it, we're stuck in some ways. We're kind of stuck or paralyzed or repeating a bunch of things that without sort of being able to free ourselves from a particular kind of cycle of behavior, or repeating a bunch of the same mistakes, or repeating a bunch of decisions and getting the same result. And this, I think, is something that emerges from psychoanalysis, this idea of repeating things compulsively, reenacting scenes from your childhood again and again throughout your life. But I think what Berlant is doing is connecting that psychoanalytic understanding of being stuck or being attached or repeating things problematically to some of the economic conditions that make that attachment problematic, or that make that repetition seem like the only option. Mm-hmm. So that's where I think this theory kind of bridges some anti-capitalist economic thinking and some of this more psychoanalytic thinking, kind of brings both of them together in a very exciting way, I think.
Yeah, really well said. And I love that intersection. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I think this is related to what you were just saying in that last answer. But the role that desire plays in a capitalist consumer society, as well as in much of psychoanalytic theory, and its attachment to consumption. And I think you're touching on that with the American way of life. Also, the attachment to the overall economic system of really a libertarian or neoliberal capitalism that is on every front showing us that it can no longer do what its basic promises are. And particularly with the climate crisis, we see that it's the very externalizing, hyper-consumptive, sort of anarchy of the market approach to an economic system that climate change and many other things are basically telling us we can no longer continue with. But for Americans who have been told their entire lives that capitalism is synonymous with freedom and democracy, like you really cannot, pull those things apart from one another in the mind of the average American, it seems like we're in a sort of dire position with regards to climate change and tackling the crisis in the just and equitable ways that it really demands, but also having this deep attachment psychologically to the very economic system that has produced this monstrosity in the first place. So I was just hoping that maybe you could say some words on climate change particularly, and how cruel optimism comes into play on that front.
Yeah, I think, Breht, you said it really well yourself, that we're attached to an economic system that is actively working toward our destruction, right? So this is a definitional, problematic attachment, or in Berlant's words, they write about how it's cruel optimism when you're attached to something that's going to prevent your flourishing. So I think it's pretty clear that we will not flourish in the next, 50 years, 25 years, if things continue to work as they do in our current economy. But it's really hard to imagine alternatives, and it's really scary. One thing, when I'm of the often find myself in these classic intergenerational conversations with my parents, who were these, first members of their family to go to college and really bought into this kind of meritocratic idea that if you, work hard and do the right thing, things are going to work out for you. And they have not completely worked out for my parents by any means. But when we talk about making these kind of big changes to the way that this country operates, to the way that the global economy operates, my parents' question is always, well, what would we do instead? And even if I have answers to those questions, we were talking about healthcare the other day, and they were asking me, like, well, how would it work if we had a different healthcare system than we have now? And even when I have answers, as someone who has thought, a lot about Medicare for all and other ways of providing healthcare as opposed to the system we have now, there's still this kind of real fear when I talk to my parents about doing something differently, doing something other than, as you said, what they've been told is the best way to do things. And so I think when it comes to climate change, imagining what our lives would look like if we're not a car-dependent society. I think the car is a good example because people are often quite attached to their cars, right? Like their cars have, meant something to them personally, even if now there are these objects that might be kind of damaging their future. It's really hard to think about how your life would work without a car, given the society that we live in now, because our society we live in is designed for cars. So you think about, well, how would I get to work, and how would I see my family, and how would my kid get home from school? And, all of these questions come up. And, part of the challenge, I think, of addressing climate change, but addressing, any of these big problems is having the sort of I don't know whether it's the poise or the solidarity or just the ability to enter this space of uncertainty or enter this space of imagination, to detach from what we know, from the kind of system that we have and that has felt like it's working for us, even if it's not actually working for us, but it feels like it's working for us because we're getting from point A to point B. And try to exist in this space of possibility, in the space of uncertainty. I think that's really hard psychologically for people. I think it's really, really hard to imagine something different than what you've been told to want and what you have felt yourself to want and what feels kind of sometimes like the only way that things could work. Climate change, I think, is a really big one in this respect, but I think this idea of imagining or allowing for some new possibility is a big challenge across the left in a bunch of different causes and a bunch of different organizing contexts.
Yeah, and I also think I think what you said is spot on, and I share like that experience with talking to older members of my family as well, like well-intentioned, good-hearted, kind people, but they're sort of trapped in the box of, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, if you will. And there is this fear of change, and it's very human. And, it's tied to loss aversion, like people would rather keep what little they have than gamble what little they have on the possibility of having more, but also the possibility of losing what they have. And I think that goes some length to explaining people's attachment to their health insurance, which everybody hates, but to say, hey, we're going to take that away from you causes real fear. And I think sometimes on the left, specifically, younger people in general, which tend to gravitate towards the left, I think, they don't really have an appreciation for this psychological element of humanity, this fear of change. And because we have a blind spot there, I think sometimes we don't adequately address that. We can come up with all the rational answers, but on so many levels, this fear of change is visceral, it's emotional, sometimes it's subconscious. And I think we have a lot of work to do trying to get through to people by taking that psychological fear seriously. And I'm not exactly sure how to do that, but maybe being less patronizing and having some understanding of that reality could set us on the right path. Do you have any ideas about how to tear down that barrier?
No, it's such a good question. And I think you're right. It's scary. It is just scary. I mean, I think this is why Berlant's metaphor and example of leaving what I think they call a non-reciprocal relationship, just a relationship that's not really working. I mean, I think a lot of us can understand viscerally the fear of that, the fear of leaving a person that you've been with for a really long time, but that that being in a relationship with this person is not ultimately going to lead to your sort of peace and happiness and well-being. That's a terrifying experience for so many people. And I think that same fear is often felt in these other contexts. I mean, I think what you said about being less patronizing or not even trying to persuade necessarily through reason is an important, those are two important points. And I can say in my experience as a union organizer, the thing that I always, among a few things that I try to remember is to be compassionate. And so listening to people's fears and validating them, and trying to connect with them on that emotional level is a huge part of my job. And not just saying, well, actually, it's in your best interest to have a union represent you, and here's why. But to sort of hear them say, I feel really scared about changing the way that my job operates. Right now my job, it's not perfect. My job's not perfect, but a lot of it's working really well. And you're talking about this big, scary unknown. And then how would my job work? And what if something bad happened? And what if my supervisor was, mad at me? And what if they, I spoke to someone 2 days ago who said, I think they would just eliminate my job if we unionized. And I feel like part of my job as an organizer is to really hear that fear and validate that and say, that totally makes sense why you would worry about that. And that must be really uncomfortable to think about, that as a consequence. And then this sort of takes us back to this idea of collectivity, and moving away from the individual and to say, in this conversation with this particular worker, to say what we're imagining is that you wouldn't go through that experience alone, that we would all be with you and we would have your back. And if during the campaign you experienced pushback or retaliation, we wouldn't leave you. We'd be right there. And that, I think these things have to kind of go hand in hand, this idea of you're not alone and this idea of there's a big scary change that needs to happen.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well said, especially in the context of union organizing, like dealing with individual people and their individual fears. Leading with compassion is certainly a step in the right direction. I thinking about climate change really quick before we move on as well.
Yeah.
The individualization of the climate problem, it's like you need to cut down on your energy use. You can walk to work, etc. We now know that was actually a strategy of the fossil fuel industry to shift the burden away from their industry onto individual sort of consumers, and we can see that's a sort of cynical attempt on their part to put the blame away from themselves. But I still have this affective dimension of my life where, because I know sort of obsessively have studied climate change and know it so well, know exactly, the science behind greenhouse gases, know the trajectories, know the different degrees and what they portend. I have this deepening sense of despair going about my normal life, driving my car to pick up my kids. I go and stand outside the building for my first grader to come out of his class, and I just look around at all these SUVs just lined up around the block waiting for these kids, just idling, running, and every time I throw away a piece of plastic, everything is plastic wrapped in America, it seems. Single-use plastics, I use it for 3 seconds, throw it in the trash can. I just have this overwhelming sense of despair. I know that the things that I'm individually doing aren't contributing really to the problem. Like if me and everybody I know were to be raptured tomorrow and never do another carbon footprint, the problem would not have any significant dent in it whatsoever. But I still have this emotional sort of purgatory, it feels like, where I am still contributing to a way of life, almost by necessity, of course, but with all the knowledge that comes with where that way of life ultimately leads, and particularly for my kids and their future. And I just don't really know how to square that circle, if you will. Do you have any thoughts on that individual sense of helplessness in the face of such a global catastrophe such as climate change?
Yeah, I mean, my gosh, I hear your despair, and I feel it too. I think it's really hard to pay any attention and not feel that kind of fear and despair. I mean, I think it's complicated, right? Because it's not it's not that individual consumers are responsible for climate change, as you just said. This is not sort of the right framework to think about it. But it is also true that what we're imagining is a situation where individuals don't have to drive their cars everywhere and don't have to, use single-use plastic, or, don't have to consume in the particular way that a lot of us feel we have to now, or have become accustomed to, or become habituated to. And so I think it's not necessarily holding individuals responsible to say that as part of addressing the climate crisis, our behaviors will have to change. I think the idea is that they will change in part by other changes happening that facilitate these choices, right? So if we have better public transit, so I live in the greater Boston area, and there's a mayoral race right now, and one of the candidates wants to make the subway system we have free. That's part of her platform. And so that's the kind of change that I think makes it so that individuals don't have to drive, or makes public transit a more appealing and available option for a lot of people. Many people are already taking public transit just by necessity, but if you have the bus and the subway free, that's a huge deal, and that's going to help people move away from a car culture. But then I do think there is a kind of tricky emotional dimension, and this is where this idea of attachment and imagining other ways of life comes in, because just when the public transit becomes free doesn't necessarily mean that everyone are ready and willing to make the leap away from the car, right? So there will be some emotional complication to that change. And so that's not necessarily saying, you person driving a car, you are the reason that the climate is degrading. But it is to say that, as we collectively make these changes to facilitate a different way of life and to mitigate the climate crisis, we will, as individuals, as people living our lives, have to also change some of our behaviors. And I think just sort of starting to become comfortable with that idea, or starting to imagine that possibility, does feel kind of like part of this in some way.
Yeah, totally. There is this prefigurative element psychologically to trying to do whatever you can in your life, given what you know to be coming, to try to prefigure the ways of living and being insofar as you can that will be necessary in the future due to the climate crisis. And I think that can be a proactive and helpful way to deal with some of the emotional elements of the climate crisis without necessarily falling into the trap of individualizing the problem and its solution. So, it's certainly worth thinking about. But another aspect of this approach that I'm really curious about, and listening to you talk about Lauren's work and your ideas surrounding it really got me thinking, is how it can be applied to comprehending the far right. Because I have this sense that the psychology and affective elements intrinsic to Trumpism and to current iterations of like neo-fascism more broadly sort of needs to be properly understood by those of us on the liberatory left. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this front. I'm leaving the question very open. You can take it in any direction that you see fit.
Sure. Well, so I think you've probably heard us discuss this on Open Source, an article that Berlant wrote for the New Inquiry in the run-up to Trump's election as president, where she talked about the part of the emotional appeal of Trump, or why Trump was so appealing to so many Americans. And she I don't know if she actually said this line, but the basic gist was something like, it's emotional, stupid. It's not that he's, has any ideas. It's not even that people think, oh, if he's president, he's going to make my life better. That wasn't, their argument about his appeal. But it was instead that what Trump showed was a kind of freedom that was really appealing, and a freedom to take his messy emotional life and just voice all of it. So all, and this is, we're going back a little to the psychoanalytic way of thinking here that, in all of us, even us good liberatory leftists, we have a lot of kind of messy sentiments. We go by someone and we think, God, I just hate that person. I really, and then if we were to pause and we'd say, well, of course I don't hate them. Sometimes they annoy me, but I know that they're basically a good person, but in that kind of, in our unconscious, in our sort of almost, I'm giving words to sort of unconscious feelings, we have these kind of violent, aggressive, very unsocially acceptable feelings. And Trump just says all of them. He just takes these things that are the mess of internal life and puts them out there. And he does it without shame and without fear of being, reprimanded. And when he is reprimanded, he responds with that same kind of freedom. He insults people and, has these creative, insulting nicknames for anyone who's ever sort of spoken ill of him. And that is, that's a very, very appealing vision, I think. I think even, for people who don't hold Trump's politics, I think just even on an emotional level, seeing someone be that free and that comfortable with themselves, in Berlant's argument, can be appealing. And so they sort of go on to argue that for a certain segment of American society that has been told in various ways that they don't matter or don't matter in a particular way, or that their ideas don't matter, or that their experiences don't matter, Trump is great because, in Berlant's words, he gives this message that internal lives matter. Your internal life matters. And so I think, in a kind of simple way, this is just an argument about taking emotions really seriously in politics and, not sort of imagining that people are going to be won over by arguments or by rational thinking or by telling them that certain policies or ideas are in their best interest. And that's not necessarily a new idea. I think a lot of us are aware that a given politician's appeal is primarily emotional as opposed to, rational. But I think, this argument about Trump specifically was quite smart because it was talking about, to some, Trump is so repulsive. And I even wonder, and Berlant doesn't go on to talk about this in the article, but I even wonder if that repulsion is kind of the other side of the coin. For people for whom Trump is so appealing, because it's like, yes, just take all the sort of, shameful feelings you have and just put them out there, that there are some people who are going to react defensively against that and be like, oh my gosh, I don't even want to know that I have shameful thoughts. I don't even want to know that I have aggression. I don't even want to know that I ever have any of these less than admirable thoughts or feelings. So, get it away. I never want to think about it. And that's a very sort of, again, psychoanalytic way of thinking about an object, right? Like either bring it close to me or get it away. I never want to see it again. So I don't know that this accounts necessarily for all of, there are so many different kind of permutations of the far right and of, there are different kind of factions and different goals and priorities. And I am certainly not an expert in this political scene, but I guess what I do take from Berlant's work, especially thinking about Trump and Trump's appeal and maybe the lack of appeal of the Democratic Party, I think this idea that, or it kind of goes back in a way to what we were talking about with organizing and compassion and recognizing people's emotional experiences, people's fears, people's emotional lives, that is going to be part of politics, and pure argument about what's good for someone or not good for someone is not really going to ever convince anyone to, vote in a different way or do anything other than what they're already inclined to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really insightful. And Trump has been called America's id, and it makes sense on that level. That there is this sort of visceral, emotional dimension to Trump's appeal that a lot of people on the left, I mean, especially I think like technocratic liberals in the wake of his election, I mean, they bent over backwards trying to figure it out, and they constantly attempted to retreat into this appeal to rationality, missing the fact that so much of his appeal was precisely in its irrationality. And I think there's something fundamentally exhilarating about open irrationality that is at the core of fascism more broadly. I think that's perhaps another topic for another day. But I certainly also, I also sort of deeply resonate with your point about we all have these feelings in us. I mean, this is sort of a psychoanalytic point broadly of like these more base emotions and feelings we have get sublimated into other things. And I remember just like recently going on, I was going on an airplane, and it was obviously everybody has to wear their mask, and of course, there's always going to be one person on there that just wants to push the boundaries and not do it. Or, this guy was like sitting a few rows in front of me, wearing a mask down underneath his mouth and nose. Like, everybody else was being an adult and wearing their mask, and he just making a point of not doing it. And I just felt this feeling of aggression, and like, your inner dialogue starts going like, I hate this asshole, like screw him, like, and then I try to realize just how ultimately self-defeating that was, just to sit there and stew in my own resentment. And so there's this Buddhist sort of mantra that one chants to others, like, may you be happy, may you be safe, may you be free from suffering, and trying to catch myself when I'm in those particularly dark, resentful moods, and then whoever the object of that disdain happens to be, applying that mantra to them and seeing if I can cultivate compassion even for somebody who I'm sort of, in a knee-jerk way repulsed by, I think is at the very least an interesting exercise. And has been something that I try to do, because it really doesn't feel good to be locked in this state of hating your neighbor or going off on these fantasies about how this person must be the worst person on earth because in this moment they're not, doing a thing that I think that they should be doing. So I don't know. It's a very complicated situation, but yeah.
I think that's very beautiful and very, very impressive. But I also wonder, if for someone else, if hating their neighbor might feel kind of good, right? Like there's some, I'm thinking of some, some experiences where sometimes it feels good to indulge in that kind of aggression or that kind of violent emotion. And, I think I think part of, to go back to Trump's appeal, that he performs that indulgence of aggressive feeling that, so many other politicians would say, would think to themselves, well, I can't say this about someone else because it's sort of too much. It's over the top. I'm going to look like a fool. And he just does. And I think there is, in a way, that kind of licenses the indulgence of aggressive feeling in some people, or some people sort of respond to that, or it resonates with them. And, I don't mean, I certainly, I don't think that lasting happiness and lasting peace is achieved that way by any means. But I do think, in a way, this takes us back to climate change. I do think that in the present moment, indulging one's, aggression or violence, and this happens both, on the left and on the right for sure, can feel really satisfying and can feel kind of just good, feel nice. But of course, the question is, like, what are the long-term consequences of that, both for you and for the society that you live in? And this is where I think we do come back to the climate, that, indulging in current pleasure or in current satisfaction or in current sort of delight of some kind, the delightful indulgence of your desire, having your desire immediately gratified, can lead to this sort of dissatisfaction and discomfort down the road. And that's always a challenge for people, figuring out how to postpone or dismiss short-term gratification in the interest of some long-term, more sustainable happiness.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, there's a sense of feeling superior that comes with hating somebody or indulging in those feelings. And I also think that there's this dimension in American politics and probably global politics more broadly is of like this, I don't know, this hatred of the other, of your neighbor, seeing everybody through your political prism, neighbors turning on neighbors, family turning on family. It is kind of convenient for the status quo. And I don't know if this is a conscious strategy employed by those with wealth and power, but it's certainly advantageous to them to sort of shift your critical eye away from those with power and wealth and those who actually make the decisions in our society, and actually turn that toward the person standing next to you, your coworker, your uncle, or whoever it may be. And I think we have to sort of break the fever on this in one way or another of this, hating the people around you sort of feeling. And in the height of the Trump era, there was this on the left and the right, this sensation of like, especially in the most heated moments, like everybody you look at, which side are you on? And you just sort of judge by maybe how they're behaving, whether or not they're wearing a mask, how they're dressed, what sort of side of the political spectrum that they are on, and then sort of indulging in the fantasy of how that must be a bad person because this, and this. And I think that is incredibly corrosive to a society. We're going to have to come together despite our differences if we have any chance of facing the climate crisis. And I think that politicians will continue to play into this hating your neighbor thing because it serves their purpose. It's really good for mainstream media to tune in and get worked up about, and it continues the status quo rolling on. So I think whenever we feel those feelings in ourselves, we should be very, very suspicious of them and use our awareness to sort of, strip them of their most, sharp edges, if you will.
Yeah, no, I think that's really wise. And I think the challenge is always, I think anger can be great for mobilizing, right? That I think, a lot of people get angry for very good reasons, because their job sucks, or because, their boss sucks, or they can't sort of, make a sustainable and secure life for themselves and their family. And the question, I guess, is how, or maybe I sort of think about two questions associated with this, which is like, one, how do you direct that anger toward its proper object, which is sort of what you're saying, right? Like, how do you not be angry at your neighbor who you think has it easier than you in some way? Or if that's just the proximate person, that's the person you see. So you think, all right, that's the person I'm mad at. How do you redirect that anger toward, the owners of the means of production, or toward the, Jeff Bezoses of the world? And then how do you not let the anger sort of, I think this is what you're saying in a way about your relationship to, detachment, or to be able to recognize your feeling but not get caught up in it, and to be able to shift your relationship to the thing or the person that has caused that feeling. How do you not let the anger that you maybe righteously feel corrode, to use your word, your assessment of the right strategy, or your ability to actually do work, right? Like, I think that this is just something that I think a lot about in organizing, wanting to say, yes, like, you have every right to be upset about this. This is valid, yes, and now we need to get to work. And we can't just be angry. We can't just sit here, I don't know, tweeting or whatever it is that we want to do to vent our anger. We actually have to do some things that are going to address the problem, and are actually going to, build power and put us in a position to win against the people or the institution that we're actually mad at, our employer, or whatever it is. So it's a delicate operation, or there's a little bit of a back and forth, I think, between the emotion and the actual kind of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, for sure. And it is worth stating, because you mentioned Twitter, that these big social media platforms are algorithmically inclined to play into your absolute worst base feelings and exacerbate them. And so taking some time away from that and just organizing instead of, screaming online is huge for a bunch of reasons. But one of them is that you're brought back down to earth. You talk to people that are regular human beings dealing with regular life issues, and you don't get swept up in this hyper emotive ideology silo effect of hating everybody that's not exactly in your exact position politically, etc. So being suspicious of those big tech platforms, I think, is important here too.
Yeah, that's probably a good warning for sure.
For sure. So, sort of attached to this right-wing stuff, I've for a long time argued that there seems to be this subconscious death drive on the American right. I think the mainstreaming of conspiratorialism, like the self-defeating anti-mask and anti-vax positions, their continued climate denialism, although maybe it's shifted a little bit from outright denial to more subtle forms of denial. But they all seem to be, if we're going off a cliff, let's hit the gas instead of the brake. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the role of the death drive on the right, and maybe also within America and capitalism itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and a great way of thinking about it. I'm not a Freudian expert by any means, but if I guess when I think of the death drive, there's an aspect to it where it's in the pursuit of pleasure that you're moving toward death, if I remember correctly, that it's not simply I'm out to destroy, or I'm going, I want to burn it all down. It's sometimes I want to feel really good. I mean, and this is, as we were talking about, like, I want to feel really good can be aggressive. I want to feel really good by being aggressive. I want to feel really good by being cruel. But, sometimes, and I think this is the sort of tragedy of it, or the pathos of it, is that the person pursuing the death drive does not know that they are pursuing death. And I think, not to take it to too dark a place, but this can be seen around some of the anti-vax stuff, right? That's for some people, this is, it's not, in this case, I don't think it's quite a pursuit of pleasure, but it's, I want to protect my family. Like, I don't want to do something like get the vaccine that I think is going to risk or harm my family. And so I think one of the, I guess to go back to climate change, what we were talking about shifting our consumer society, I think we see in a way the death drive in operation, where it's thinking, well, it gives me so much pleasure to, to get food from all around the world all the time. This is just a stray example, right? To be able to go to the grocery store and to buy, any kind of fruit or vegetable I want, or to buy any kind of packaged food I want. I walk into the grocery store and I take pleasure in the amount of choices that are available to me, and then I indulge those choices. I buy the food I want from all corners of the globe, and that keeps the demand up for those supply chains. It keeps that particular, global agriculture in operation, which is leading ultimately to my death by continuing this kind of climate degradation. So that's where I think, as we've been talking about so much during this conversation, things get hard. And this takes us right back to cruel optimism and to these kind of attachments that we have that are not good for us. And the challenge of understanding that what feels really good in that moment, which is having my choices at the grocery store, choosing exactly what I want, having it fit exactly my sort of whims of the moment, and, not having to think about the consequences of these choices, figuring out or understanding that is an action I am taking against myself, even though it feels like I am choosing for myself. That's really hard, just to kind of get emotionally. And as we've been saying, this is not to say that someone, buying a mango in the grocery store is responsible for climate change by any means, but just that this idea of the death drive that you bring up, I think is so hard to fully get our heads around in some way, because it feels like pleasure in the moment. It feels like pleasure. It feels like freedom. It feels sometimes almost like taking care of ourselves by getting this thing that we feel like we want or we need or we crave, or we would be injured in some way not to have. And so this is where we get back to this idea of having to imagine other ways of caring for ourselves, of experiencing pleasure, of, experiencing beauty, or whatever it is that we feel like we're achieving in these more problematic transactions, but moving away from actions and behaviors and global systems that are actively leading us toward some kind of destruction. So yeah, I think you're totally right to bring up the death drive as kind of instrumental to everything that's happening here. And, how we get out of that does have to, in some way be to recognize, I think to recognize what we're getting out of these things, whatever these behaviors or transactions, whatever it is, what are we getting? We're getting something. We wouldn't be doing it if we weren't getting something out of it. And to imagine sort of other ways that we can be gratified, I guess.
Yeah, completely. And I mean, I think it's well known that there's obviously, I think, you bringing up the pleasure aspect of the death drive is really important, because with you're talking about conspiratorialism, we've long known that conspiratorialism lends to its believer a sense of like being in on a secret truth, a sense of like I know and others don't. And that can be in and of itself pleasurable. And I often sometimes think, like the old cliche, ignorance is bliss. I was talking to my wife the other day. I was like, some conservatives in my family are so certain that the COVID is really not that big of a deal, and that climate change honestly is not a big deal whatsoever. That there's almost like this this day-to-day carefreeness that they can enjoy that has been completely robbed from me and millions of other people who take these problems seriously. And so I think you're incredibly on point to point out the pleasure aspect of turning away, because to really fully, on a lower level, understand the pandemic is real, but on a higher level that the climate crisis is real and that's going to completely shape our futures in negative ways, is incredibly hurtful. It's painful. And to find any way to be able to rationalize your way out of that, to turn away from it, I think, there's pleasure in that for sure. Although ultimately, as you said, the long-term consequences are eventually going to show up at your front door. If you can bury your head in the sand until that very moment, you're gonna be maybe a little bit more happy on that journey to the crisis itself. I don't know, but yeah.
Hopefully, yeah, yeah. But I mean, this is why I do think psychoanalysis is such a helpful way of thinking about things, because what you said is right. We all have these defenses that we activate when things are scary or challenging, or I think scary is kind of if something is scary, we have our mind, our beautiful nimble mind has ways of getting rid of it. Whether what you said, rationalizing, denying, right? Just denying that these things, COVID isn't real, climate change is a hoax, whatever. Like that's something that, the mind is really well equipped to do. And so I think, that's part of what psychoanalytic thought has given us, is a way of understanding, what we might think of as defenses, or we might think of as reactions, right? The kind of reactivity we have when something comes toward us that we do not want because it's going to mess with our enjoyment, with our peace, with our tranquility, with our comfort. We react in a variety of ways. And so I think that, and this is what I think is great about Berlant's work and their engagement with psychoanalysis, is being able to name and recognize and understand what you're doing, what you're experiencing as defense, as reaction, as irrational, not to say irrational and therefore dumb, or irrational and therefore, you're an idiot. It's irrational and therefore, yes, you are human. You are an irrational creature that defends itself against threats, against things that feel threatening. And I think it's that recognition that might lead us to imagine other ways of behaving, or other ways that we might respond to threat.
Yeah, and when you mentioned that there's this level of awareness that can come into play when you're feeling those emotions, when we're talking about psychoanalysis broadly, or just affect theory, certainly made me think about it, is its relationship to Buddhism. And this is obviously, for longtime listeners of the show, something I'm incredibly interested in. I've been practicing Buddhist meditation and studying Buddhist philosophy my entire adult life. And for me, there's with a meditation practice, there's this, increasing intimacy with and clarity about my own emotional reactions. I've developed the capacity to feel emotions as sensations in the body, rather than letting my thoughts run away with them and build sandcastles in my imagination, which just perpetuate the negative feelings, etc., or, attempt to escape or repress those uncomfortable emotions in the myriad ways that humans do. I know you mentioned that you have a sitting practice yourself. So just in the broad purview of this entire conversation, what do you think Buddhism and meditation can possibly offer us in this broader context?
Oh man, that's such a good question, and it sounds like you have a much more sophisticated practice than I do. Mine really comes out of my asana practice, which is much easier for me than sitting, and I think it's especially challenging because I think as someone who loves to think and loves to follow thoughts, meditation's really hard for me because, in the rest of my life, I'm, thoughts are something that I want to sort of move toward. And so being able to sort of just sit and watch and let be is super, super challenging. So, well done for you for being able to have that really robust practice.
Well, I certainly don't want to overstate it, but go ahead.
No, I mean, or any kind of consistent practice, I guess I should say is really wonderful. But I think maybe one way to think about it. I mean, I think to go back to something we were talking a little bit about before, just because problems are collective doesn't mean that individuals would be in error to take action to help themselves or those close to them. I think we were talking before about depression and anxiety and how, these can maybe sometimes better be understood as collective experiences. But I don't think that we would then say, well, individual suffering should not seek therapy, right? So I think, what you've described and what you were describing as well on the airplane, it does seem that when you're, living in these really disruptive moments like we're living in now, and, probably honestly, like people have been living in kind of forever, practices of whatever kind that help you live are great, and especially if those practices are things that move you toward peace or equanimity as opposed to practices that maybe are compensatory in some way. Not to sort of, obviously there are moments where really what you need is to go buy a new dress or something like that. Like sometimes that's legitimately what you need. I'm thinking about buying a new dress because I have not bought a new dress in a very long time. And there are moments where I'm like, it would be really nice to go buy a new dress. Sure. But I think if your vision of, to use a word that's talked bandied around a lot, sort of sometimes incorrectly, self-care, if your vision of that is completely bound up with some of the systems that we've been talking about, like, this sort of, if it's completely bound up with a capitalist economy, if it's completely bound up with really sort of problematic supply chains and consumption practices, if that's the only way or that you've been exposed to kind of deal with some of the disruption that you're experiencing. You go to work and your work is terrible, and then you compensate for that by drinking, or you compensate for that by buying something. Then you're kind of caught up in this pretty difficult system. And so I think what you've described, practices like meditation, or there's tons of other, I think, practices that people find that help them step outside of that sort of exchange or that kind of more transactional place, and give them other ways of achieving, comfort or peace or pleasure. Maybe it's taking a walk outdoors, right? It doesn't always have to be something necessarily as formalized, I think, as a meditation practice. I think those can be really, really helpful and really sustaining. And I think it takes us back a little bit to what we've, pleasure has kind of been a theme of this conversation. What does pleasure do for us? Where do we seek it? How does seeking pleasure actually harm us or sort of move us toward a destructive place? It seems, I don't know that you would probably call your meditation practice a pleasure, but I wonder if it doesn't give you a different relationship to pleasures, or give you a different relationship to pleasure seeking. I mean, maybe I'll just ask you that. Like, does it change the way you think about gratifying desire, or taking pleasure in things?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it shows me with increasing clarity how so much of what I take to be pleasure is often, repressed discomfort that leads in negative ways. So, if for me pleasure, because so much of my life, and, I don't want to get too deep into it, but, family of addiction and stuff, lots of addicts in my family, it's shown me that the things I take to be pleasure are actually things that I do in the short term to alleviate suffering that the thing that I'm trying to cover it up with only leads to more of. And so, it's not always the easiest thing to just stop doing those things, but it helps me see it, and being able to see it is often the first step in meaningfully addressing them. And then on the other side, it reorients what I take to be pleasure. So when I'm really keeping up with my practice and really taking it seriously, I get so much pleasure out of the tiniest things. I get pleasure of the sun shining through my window and casting light and shadow on the floor. I get pleasure from going outside and feeling the heat of the sun on my skin, the glint of sun off the trees, little bugs in the ground. Like even just sitting in a chair and stopping my inner dialogue and falling into the sensations of my body, that can be immensely pleasurable. And so it's really reoriented my conception of what real pleasure is, and how so much of not just me, but I think people in general take to be pleasure is really our escaping displeasure and creating more of that displeasure via the way that we attempt to pursue pleasure, if that makes sense. So
yeah. I mean, and not to be like too conspiratorial about it, but we are. Those appetites are engineered in us quite often,
absolutely.
right? The appetites for food or drink or other forms of consumption. And, what you describe is really beautiful. And in some of my, I think my own process of discovering those things, which has come, in a bunch of different ways and through different relationships with people who have that kind of awareness and being kind of open to that. My partner has been really great at teaching me to be in nature, and that has been a very kind of meaningful thing for me. But sort of I've had these thoughts sometimes of, why was this kept from me? Or why wasn't I taught that all of this was right here, that what you're describing, the sensations or awareness of other experiences of beauty or comfort, they're all right here, kind of just free and available. Why wasn't I made aware of this earlier on? And then I think, well, no one's going to profit from that.
Exactly.
No one's going to profit from my enjoying, looking at the birds outside my window, right? They're going to profit from me being on Twitter. They're going to profit from me buying, a bunch of new dresses, right?
Exactly.
So that's what we're up against. And I think, both you and I are sort of acknowledging in different ways that none of this is easy, that this is all kind of swimming upstream in some way to be relating to the world in some of the ways that we've described, that this is, you're up against pretty powerful industries that really want you to have that kind of escapist behavior and to have those kind of compensatory behaviors. And, it takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of, courage in some ways to step away from that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm I'm still a work in progress for sure. But the thing that you mentioned about nature, I think that is one thing that everybody can do pretty easily, which is just make some time every day if possible, but every week, more likely, to just get out into nature and just be among it by yourself. Like the therapeutic, psychological, emotional benefits of spending regular time out in the natural world, I think, are huge. And this deep sense of like wanting to protect it, wanting to act in its defense, naturally sort of begins to bubble up when you spend enough time in nature. And, I think, if you don't want to get into meditation, or some of these practices seem too esoteric, just spending good time in nature. And if you're a parent, taking your kids out to spend time in nature and developing that love in them, I think is one of our surest defenses against the destruction of the biosphere. Because people that really love nature, specifically like indigenous people who conceptualize themselves as part of nature, like inextractable from it, are on the front lines fighting against extractive industries and colonialism and capitalism, which are destroying the earth. And that's not a coincidence. The more separate from nature larger you feel yourself to be, the easier it is to destroy it as something other than yourself. And so reuniting with it and cultivating that intimacy with it, I think, is something we could all do. And it benefits us, and hopefully it'll benefit the world down the line. Yeah,
that's wonderful. That's really well put.
So I know we're coming up on a time limit here, but I want to shift gears a little bit before we end, and I just want to, say that you come out of the world of literature, and I used to be much more into like fiction myself, trying to write it and also just reading it constantly. But lately it's sort of gone away in favor of nonfiction for whatever reason. But I just want to present to you this question. You can take it however you want, but what can literature offer us today in these anxiety-ridden and uncertain times?
Oh man, what a sort of important and challenging question. I'm going to be a little cheeky and say that I think it's important to recognize that there are some things literature cannot offer us, because sometimes I think that there's an expectation, and I'm a literary critic. I'm constantly writing book reviews and criticism. I'm constantly reading book reviews and criticism. So I'm a little bit, in these kind of narrow conversations where everyone's reading and reviewing the same novel and fighting about it. It can be kind of silly, but it can also be kind of fun when a bunch of people care about the thing that you care about. And sometimes, I've noticed, especially in the last few years, there is often a desire from readers and from critics that novels should be doing kind of political work. That literature should be doing political work, and that a book that represents something that we object to politically or morally is therefore a bad book. And I don't know that this is maybe the most helpful way to think about what literature can do. I certainly would never say that literature can't affect social or political change, because I think we have a wonderful long history in this country and across the world of activist writers who have used poetry and drama and fiction and essays and memoir to actually have real sort of meaningful political impacts. But I think having that be sort of what we go to literature for and what we expect it to do can lead to a lot of frustration and disappointment. I would say that, there's someone once said that art is amoral. And I don't know that that's always true, but I think there needs to be that possibility, or there needs to be room for art to explore moral and political issues without necessarily instructing on them, or without actually imagining that it is intervening in them. So again, this is not to say that activist literature, I'm even thinking, just because we've been talking about climate change, I'm thinking of, Kim Stanley Robinson, great writer on sort of climate issues, and that, I think that is kind of a form of, social and political work. Although I don't know that we would say, right, that reading one of those novels is a way to work toward mitigating the climate crisis, that these are sort of different things. So I guess, for me, what literature does, and what it can sort of do in this moment, I think kind of goes back to a couple of the things you and I have been talking about. So one thing we were just talking about is beauty and pleasure. And I think for me, kind of the reason I'm in this line of work and I stay in it has to do with my finding those things in literature, feeling kind of moved by literature, or feeling kind of aesthetic pleasure, aesthetic awe of someone else's creation is really important. And, obviously sometimes I have to purchase a book or something, so there's some consumer element to it. But I do think the pleasure of reading is different maybe from the pleasure of buying a new dress. Although I'm sure someone else who sees fashion as an aesthetic realm might think differently about it. So I think that's one thing it can do. And I guess the other thing is what we've been talking about awareness, right? Awareness and understanding and recognition, and the ability to sort of step back from emotional experience and just kind of look at it. And I do think that is something that literature lets us do in the sort of mediation of reading about experience, reading about a particular experience that's being captured in a poem or a play or a novel, and allowing us just to kind of witness it and to kind of dig into it and become absorbed in it and then step back from it and think about it, I do think it facilitates this kind of awareness that we've been talking about. And I think cultivating that awareness is just a sort of, it's a nice tool, and so whether you're achieving it through meditation or through walks in the woods or, undergoing psychoanalysis, I do think, reading can be a part of that process of better awareness and understanding. So that's what it offers me. I think it can offer other things maybe to other people.
Yeah, no, well said. There's a very unique pleasure that comes with reading a really engrossing work of fiction that is really hard to compare to anything else. My daughter is breaking into her teen years, and she's really developing this love of reading fiction, and I encourage the hell out of it, and I love to see that blossom within her. Kim Stanley Robinson, of course, is a previous guest here on Rev Left, so if you want to...
Oh, great.
Yeah, he's a wonderful a person and a great person to talk to. People are interested in that. Go check it out. But I know we're up on a time limit here, so I just have one more question before I let you go. And I would love to have you back on to just talk about this work, but you are the author of The Equivalents, the story of art, female friendship, and liberation in the 1960s. Can you briefly just talk about that work of yours and sort of what it's about for people out there that might be interested?
Sure. So it is a group biography of, I guess that's one way of categorizing it. It's the story of a circle of women, 5 women artists and writers who met in 1960 or in the early 1960s here in Cambridge at the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study, which was a program run by Radcliffe College, the sister college of Harvard, that was designed to bring women who had family commitments of some kind, but who also had intellectual or creative ambitions, and give them a fellowship, basically. So office space, a stipend, access to Harvard's resources, and some time, 2 years to do their work. And so the book is the story of this circle of friends and their artistic collaborations, but it's also kind of the story of this particular moment in history right before the women's liberation movement really kicks off and gathers a lot of steam in the mid-1960s and kind of coming out of the 1950s, which was this era of real cultural conservatism in the U.S., kind of in the middle of the Cold War. So it's about art, it's about, community, it's about feminist history. And it's an interesting moment, I think, or the reason I found it interesting is because I am always sort of curious about these moments pre-revolution, kind of. So before everything shifts, or before a certain something shifts. And so what was interesting in writing the book is realizing or coming to better understand, just how much organizing and discussion and, creativity around feminism and motherhood and women and all of the things that we sometimes associate with what we think of as, second wave feminism, later 1960s, early 1970s, how this was going on all the time. It's always, I should sort of know this, right? As a someone with some interest in history, that, what we think about as happening at these fixed dates is usually happening kind of constantly in different parts of society, and there's usually a much longer trajectory than we're aware of. So that's the book. So if people are interested in women's history and feminist history, might be of interest.
Absolutely. I know my listeners are, and I would love to have you back on and talk more in depth about that. I'll link to it in the show notes so people can find it easily. And you're right. It's, we look back through history and think of these acute moments of uprising or protest or revolution even. But often that acute focus loses the often decades of prelude that led up to those eruptions and these longer processes that take place. And so this is, I think, a work in that general vein. And we, as I say, we very well may be in something like that period now, where we're sort of gathering the forces, and what happens in the next 10, 20 years very well might pleasantly surprise us. Humanity might rise to the challenge, as it were, and we'll look back on this period of time in a very different way than we might otherwise. But
I hope so.
Yeah, with all that said, Maggie, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I would love to have you back on to talk about anything else. There's lots of threads we put on the table we couldn't follow up on fully, but love to have you back on. But before I let you go, can you please let listeners know where they can find you and your work online?
Sure. So I have a pretty bad website, frankly. That I think is one of the first hit that you come up if you Google me. And unfortunately, I am on Twitter. So that is another place you can find me. And I usually am mostly sharing things I write. So, not too many ventings of spleen that you'll have to wade through.
Wonderful. Well, I'll link to all that in the show notes as well so people can find you easier. Thank you so much, Maggie. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much. This was really fun.
They stuck you in the dirt while I was still away. But nobody had the decency to tell me about it anyway. Well, I guess it's for the best that they laid you down to rest without some wreck like me to ruin things and turn into a mess. Well, I remember when we ran away and the car we stole broke down along some dusty desert highway with nobody else around. And so we hitched a ride to Reno, but the ring I got you wouldn't fit, and the minister got drunk before we laughed till we got sick. And of course I know you could have done much better, and I know that I must have been your bad habit, some rotten man, nobody's savior, your oldest friend. I haven't slept the same since you've been gone, and when I do sleep, the nightmares come. This hell I live in hasn't been the same without you here. Our daughter still won't speak to me. My letters aren't returned at all. I can't believe the mess I made of things. And of course I know you could have done much better, and I know that I must have been a real fucking nightmare, some rotten man, nobody's savior, your oldest friend.